everyone, welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. This week I wanted to do a solo episode on the topic of integrating non-dual insight into everyday life. So for me, if you don't know my trajectory on this, I had a kind of non-dual insight experience as a teenager, by which I mean a kind of getting out of an egoic sense of being separate from the rest of the world and recognizing that conceptual boundaries are in our heads, not out there in the world, and that really what you are is the same thing as everything else in existence. So if you let go of the kind of thinking, conceptualizing, and the struggle and the suffering, you are fundamentally held by the fact of being, which is what you are, from this perspective. So I had that experience and then engaged in, without realizing it, what would be called spiritual bypassing for a long time, where I would just kind of shift into this perspective where there's no suffering in order to avoid dealing with kind of depressive tendencies and psychotherapeutic issues that were going unaddressed, and then I could just kind of escape into this non-dual perspective and bypass these issues until I found kind of psychedelic, like psychotherapeutic methods and somatics and ways to process trauma in an embodied way in order to bring my kind of embodied sense of being a separate self into more and more alignment with this non-dual perspective, into a more peaceful, integrated way of being. And this is why I phrase this in terms of integrating non-dual insight, because the end goal is a kind of form of inner peace, just a sense of still feeling like yourself to be yourself, but then finding it much easier to flip between these two perspectives. So you've kind of integrated this insight into everyday life. And so my experience now would be actually I'm feeling more and more like a self the more I did this kind of psychotherapeutic work, but in a way where you're not lost in that. So typically, if you look at the kind of way this has been taught in things like Buddhism, they talk about waking up from a kind of delusion. So the way of thinking about it would be that in everyday life, before we have these insights, we're lost psychologically, and we think our concepts and our kind of imaginings, the way we think the world to be, we take all those to be more real than they are. And as a result, there's unnecessary suffering. And so you kind of wake up to the reality that actually, on a more fundamental level, those are not really there. They occur secondarily in this kind of fundamental level. So when what happens for me now is if I, as a self, if I start to suffer, there'll be a kind of, I would say maybe like a half a second of suffering. And then, we're just talking about, say, I stub my toe or something. But then there's that's almost like a wake-up call that there's a way out. I don't have to suffer unnecessarily in addition to the pain. So then there's a kind of shifting into just being with whatever is in its kind of raw nature. And then the pain becomes a kind of brightness and intensity rather than something that's valenced as negative. And this can also happen with emotional pain, and it's a kind of, it becomes a tool where you can move between these perspectives instead of unnecessarily fleeing from things in an unhealthy way. I would argue if you've stubbed your toe and you've registered that you shouldn't do that again which is the message that pain is sending, then it's okay to step back from the suffering and just experience it as intense. So when I wanted to initially talk about the kind of psychotherapeutic, the logic behind the approach that I took, but I think I might, if I just did that, I might be underestimating the role that the non-dual insight played in my ability to kind of walk the path that I walked. So the logic of the kind of the gradual path of psychotherapeutic improvement was the logic was effectively put myself in a safe place, in a room in my house where my phone's turned off, no one's going to come and disturb me, and then take a psychedelic and then move towards whatever makes me feel uncomfortable, move towards whatever brings up emotions of sadness, stress, fear, and then feel those emotions in an embodied way. And then it's important to say doing this as well in a very gradual way so that you can integrate it. If you overwhelm yourself, then you're just going to add more trauma. So this could, I started with kind of microdoses, and so that you have to be able to integrate what's coming up. But then an important realization as I was doing this was that when you're engaging with things mentally, there's a kind of instinct that you should be able to just kind of deal with mental material mentally. Like this is the kind of when one doesn't realize how important the embodied nature of mind is, you can just think, well, I should be able to kind of deal with this just in my head. But it turns out, because mind is something that occurs through embodied living organisms, and this is a kind of core idea of my living mirror theory, that the physical instantiation of mind is through the lived body. It's not a separate thing to the physical unfolding of the body. Because of that, you need to resource yourself with strategies to modulate your mental state. So in the same way that if you were in a dark room and you were stressed out because you heard some kind of creepy scuttling noises, you would do something to change that. So you might go and turn on the lights, orient, look around the room, search for what could be causing it. So those are tools or resources, strategies you can use to modulate your mental state in this analogy. But then in the actual circumstance of doing the kind of psychotherapeutic work, that would be things like breathing. So for me, I learned through Gay Hendricks' book Conscious Breathing, just a very simple way to breathe in a relaxed way, which has a whole bunch of effects on neurochemistry and moves you into a less, instead of getting wound up into a kind of panic attack, you're opening and moving into a more grounded, peaceful state. And then trauma release exercises of David Baselli, who I interviewed in the podcast as well, where I think I only did them once as a kind of way to fatigue the psoas muscle, this muscle that coordinates all of your large-scale fight-flight responses that occur when you're stressed. So I did them once, and it seemed to unlock this, what he calls neurogenic tremors, being generated by the nervous system. And so that became a tool that as I would feel stress in my body, there would be this tremoring that would be a way to feel it and move towards a kind of completion of the stress response. So you go from feeling peaceful, something stressful happens, and then what's supposed to happen is you come back to feeling peaceful through discharging resolving this arc from activation through to relaxation. But in modern human culture, a lot of the time we interrupt that through thinking, it's not appropriate to process my feelings in public, or to tremor, or these kind of, our prefrontal cortex effectively inhibits these responses. So we can, in this state, complete this arc and come back to a level of relaxation. So for me, those are two really important resources that I could use to modulate my mental state into a direction of processing whatever the challenging material is, but always moving towards groundedness and openness. And I think this is where having had the non-dual insight before plays a crucial role. So realizing that it's safe to surrender, realizing that your mind can't hurt you, that these are not real, that they're in the same way that the kind of material world is. Having that insight allows you to truly surrender and to know that the right direction is in terms of openness, and that if you open radically to the point where you completely let go of enforcing this boundary, this conceptual boundary between yourself and the world, if you do that in a situation where you've made sure you're safe, don't do this if you're kayaking and then decide suddenly you're going to surrender your boundary. We evolved these psychological tendencies for a reason, and as we're going about the world, it's useful to have it. But if you put yourself in a safe situation and it's safe to surrender, you can see, as you try to surrender, whatever stops you at that point from surrendering is not a rational response to the situation because you're safe. It's emotional baggage from your past. And that past you could conceptualize even as an evolutionary past that, our ancestors since life began had to struggle for survival, but there's material there to be worked through around anxiety that could be at a very existential level in terms of fear of death. But then once you learn that actually, if you're physically safe, you can surrender, your heart will still pump, your lungs will still breathe, and it's truly okay to feel completely released. It's important, I think, to know that and to have had that experience in order to trust that this is the right direction to move in. So I think a good way to frame this whole modality is once someone's had a kind of awakening experience, non-dual insight experience, whatever you want to call it, and that could be through a psychedelic, 5-MeO-DMT seems to produce this effect very reliably. High doses of mushrooms do as well. And once someone's had that experience, or spontaneously like I did, I think can happen to people through meditation, then that kind of direct path is often contrasted with a gradual path of characterized as something like meditation, where you're using techniques to gradually move in this direction. And then what I'm suggesting here is a kind of the direct path is really, the direct experience is where the path begins, and then through a bunch of different techniques you can learn to integrate this into daily life. And I actually think meditation as a kind of sitting meditation for a short period of time, if you think you're going to spend 10, 20 minutes, even an hour in the morning or evening or whenever, just at some point in the day, doing meditation, that's going to be the thing that fundamentally integrates this stuff into your whole life. I think that's a mistake. I think the way that I have always intuitively done this is really through every moment of lived experience. And so I think the concept of mindfulness is powerful, because mindfulness is something where you're not saying, okay, now I'm doing this activity of meditation. It's a capacity you can have to be mindful, to, actually etymologically, in Pali, I think the word sati comes from kind of remembering. So it's like this continual waking up to what's really going on, and recalling and remembering that you don't need to be lost in these concepts. And so when you have some kind of salient pain, that can be a kind of alarm bell to remind you to wake up to this perspective, and also to just practice the gradual part of this as well. So feeling one's emotions, feeling your feelings, is really, for a certain kind of person like myself who was emotionally constipated and backed up, and then feeling one's feelings is the way to move into resolving historic traumas and emotional challenges, and moving into a place of peace. And on that topic of peace, there's a kind of related experience I've been pondering recently, which I've not seen spoken about much. It's this, what I would call a kind of prototypically trippy psychedelic experience, where you feel like you get out of your own perspective, and you have this kind of overview effect where you're seeing the way you interact with others, the way they, all the social rules, the kind of social matrices that we're all locked in, that usually we don't notice really because we see through them. They're a way we navigate the world, and so we don't, step back and look at them. But there can be this common kind of poignant experience of seeing that in a psychedelic experience in particular. And I was kind of reflecting on what is that poignancy, because there's something that feels a little bit sad about it. And my thinking is that if you think of one way to consider consciousness, is that I exist in this phenomenal sphere. I have this experience of the world around me, and there's a fundamental kind of inability to directly contact someone else. There's a kind of fundamental isolation where they're in their own sphere of experience as well, and they never see me directly. They see me as an appearance. Right now I'm literally just a kind of appearance on a screen, presumably, if you're watching this. But the sound of my voice is also just sound waves. It's not, you're not directly contacting my mind, right? This is why telepathy would just completely destroy our fundamental thinking around mind and matter, because you have an ability to directly contact someone's mind. So that's one way you could think about what's going on, and if one is carrying emotional pain and a feeling of separation from the world, that might resonate. But I don't think it's the only way we can look at this. But I think when you're in that mode of separation and fearfulness, then you are concerned with how you appear to other people. In order to effectively navigate the world, you might be putting up certain appearances, intuitively knowing that there's this disconnect. There can be some distance between who you really are and how you show up in the world. And this is the fundamental kind of mechanism of narcissism that's exploited, that you can appear a certain way, but underneath you can be different. And that discrepancy, to me, is when we talk about darkness in someone's personality, they have a dark personality, or they're engaging in dark ways, versus light. To me, this is what that's referring to. There is an unseen, dark, shadowy, hidden space that is this gap between appearance and reality of the person. And on the other extreme, this is to engage in the thinking where it's all about separation and the fact we can't directly contact each other. But actually, when you, clearly we have the ability to coordinate with each other. As I'm using language, you could say to someone something as simple as, if you're teaching them a dance, we both step left now, right? And you're coordinating. To do that, there has to be some form of contact. It may not be a direct mental-to-mental contact, but there's some kind of contact and coordination going on there. And then if you think about, okay, well, what's at the other end of the spectrum from this dark, shadowy separation, intersubjective mode where you're exploiting the difference between yourself and your appearance? At the other end, where there's connection, it seems to me that the fundamental capacity is the ability to just be present with other people. And in that way, you're being authentic and honest in how you show up. There's no attempt to do anything. There's no... I think this difference between being, which is the kind of non-dual state, versus doing, and a kind of egoic problem-solving, planning mode where you have goals, I think that's what's at play here. And if we can move into being, you're not engaged in this egoic concern with how you appear. And so in that ability to be present with each other, that's where we find connection. And, to use the analogy of light and dark, we find light because it's all to do with kind of truth and honesty and openness. And so I think through this individual project of finding greater and greater peace and groundedness, we move into a better social situation. I think that the one way you can conceptualize what's wrong with the world is collective trauma, collective separation, and the darkness that comes up there. The fact that abuse occurs in secret when people successfully hiding it on such huge levels across the globe, of all different kinds. This is all occurring in the darkness that arises out of human separation and this psychology and the exploiting of these intersubjective blind spots. So if as each of us engages in this project, it closes down one shadowy corner of the world. And I think that's the way to move into a world that functions more healthily. Because also people who are trapped in these modes of separation, it doesn't feel nice. It's not fun. Having to show up in a certain way in the world, having to project an appearance of yourself that isn't who you are, and even if that appearance is loved, then there's a pain of that separation. So anyway, I think these are some thoughts on, to me, really, this is at the core of my interest. This is what I think is most important individually and collectively, and intellectually as well. So yeah, I hope that's been of interest. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.